Okay, let's get started with this podcast for Chapter 13. This will be a relatively short podcast. There are 18 pages in the textbook to cover. There's only 8 slides in this particular podcast. We will be covering 4 IRATs, so make sure you've printed out your outline and you're ready to make some notes. Before we get started, I would ask you to look over Figure 13.1. It involves the iron triangle. If you don't know what the iron triangle is at this point, please take a look at that figure. We'll be discussing it through this podcast. There are 5 learning objectives that we'll cover as we move through this podcast. First of all, why is the government involved in healthcare? Well, there's a philosophy of the Western Enlightenment involving the concept of happiness. We see that in our Declaration of Independence. When the Founding Fathers were talking about rights and grievances, it was also part of our U.S. Constitution with the creation of government structure. What is the government? Well, in this particular country, it involves Congress, the administration, the president, and the bureaucracy. There are the courts, and then, of course, there are citizens. What I want you to know for this slide for an IRAD is that the federal government in healthcare is influenced by 3 things: state and local action related to healthcare delivery, also information shared by special interest groups, and finally the priorities set by the president. All 3 of these things are help influence healthcare in this country. The role of government in healthcare is as a payer, insurer, direct service provider, regulatory, and research. Again, the government in many cases may only do this in a focused fashion, like direct service provider, maybe only in the DOD, the VA, the Indian Health Service. But what I want you to know from this slide for an IRAD is that an important role of the federal bureaucracy is essentially implementing laws specific to healthcare, like Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. Moving on, we come to the iron triangle. Again, I asked you to look at that Figure 13.1. It's here on the right of this slide. You need to look carefully at this, but you see at the top of the triangle is Congress, which is a legislative body. You also have bureaucracy at the lower right, which is the administration and the president. And then on the lower left is interest groups. These are usually special interest groups that are interested in something happening with the healthcare delivery in this country. But essentially from this particular slide, I want you to know that the 3 sides of the iron triangle are, as you see here, the legislative or the bureaucracy, the legislative, the Congress, the bureaucracy, which is the administration and the president, and also special interests, the citizens. When we're talking further about the government role in healthcare, there's the evolving role of government in healthcare, which you have a list here of 5 things: data and evidence for the government role, certainly looking at how other countries provide their health care, national legislation and regulations, state legislation and regulations. So oftentimes it's healthcare is duly provided by both the federal and the state legislatures. Different health policy concepts and alignment of the data, legislature, and policy to create the Affordable Care Act, which you see more recently, since 2010. Now, what I want you to get from this slide for an IRAD is that the government's role in healthcare has increased over time, and one reason for this increase might be the complexity of medical care. As you know, the technology, the different focuses of different healthcare professionals, the complexity of medical care has increased the need for the government's role in healthcare. And finally, the importance of citizens in healthcare. You need to know the role and expectations of individuals in U.S. society. A lot of this is discussed in the textbook, but as a citizen, you have a responsibility and a role in the formation of healthcare delivery in this country. There's different coalitions and the joining of individuals and the citizen as a government. So, for example, when you're now a member of the American Pharmacists Association, they have political action committees that you can belong to. There are political action committee you can make donations to, like $50 to see that something occurs in the government. You also have this at the more local and state levels, like with Pawnee and Pisney. But you need to get involved in how healthcare is delivered, changes in the rules and regulations of the State Board of Pharmacy and so on, which will occur probably in April, coming April, with Pharmacy Day, and we'll take a busload of students to the Egg there in Albany, and you'll have a chance to talk to your legislators about changing the laws. And with that is the end of this part.